Have you ever been told to get the hell out of the way so someone more important could take your place? Have you ever been looked at like you were nothing more than a piece of furniture to be moved? A mild inconvenience in someone else's grand story? What you're about to hear is the story of a man who was pushed into that very corner at 30,000 feet. His response didn't just make a flight attendant uncomfortable. It didn't just embarrass some rich kid. His response brought a multi-billion-dollar airline to its knees. Before we dive into this epic tale of karmic justice, do me a solid. Hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and get ready to drop a comment because I want to hear your stories. This isn't just a story, it's a conversation about respect, power, and what happens when the quiet ones finally decide they've had enough. Trust me, you're going to want to be here for every last satisfying detail. The first time you saw him, you wouldn't have looked twice. He was just another ghost in the machine of John F. Kennedy International Airport on a Tuesday evening. He didn't look like a man who was about to start a corporate war. He was simply another passenger in the endless river of humanity flowing through Terminal 4, a man named Julian Vance. At 52, he wore his success like a well-tailored but comfortable suit. It was there, but it didn't scream for attention. A charcoal blazer over a simple black V-neck, dark denim that cost more than most people's rent, and polished leather boots that had seen more airport terminals than a luggage cart. That man, the one who blended so seamlessly into the background, was the founder and CEO of Axiom Digital. If you've ever used a credit card, booked a flight, or accessed a secure server, you've touched his work. Axiom was the silent guardian of the digital world, a cybersecurity firm that built impenetrable fortresses for some of the world's largest corporations. One of their biggest clients? A behemoth of the skies, a national carrier we'll call Ascend Air. Julian had just spent 3 grueling days in a Manhattan high-rise, closing a deal that would redefine the next decade for Axiom Digital. It was a landmark contract, the kind of victory that should have been celebrated with champagne and backslapping. But that wasn't Julian's style. For him, the victory was the work itself, the elegant solution to an impossible problem. The flight home to Los Angeles wasn't just a commute. It was his sanctuary. It was the 5-hour buffer between the corporate predator and the quiet family man. A chance to finally exhale, to let the silence wash over him. Maybe order a smooth bourbon on the rocks and watch the city lights of America drift by beneath him. He traveled light. No entourage, no sycophantic assistant trailing behind him with a stack of papers. Just a sleek, black rollerboard and a worn leather briefcase that held the future of his company. The terminal was a symphony of chaos, gate change announcements, crying babies, the frantic clicks of 1,000 keyboards. But Julian moved through it with a practiced economy of motion, an invisible shield of calm around him. It was a skill he'd honed over decades of being underestimated. In his early days, he was the quiet tech guy in the corner, the one people talked over until they realized he was the only one in the room who could actually build the damn thing. He'd learned to let them see what they wanted to see, right up until the moment it mattered. A few people cast fleeting glances his way, their brows furrowing with that vague sense of recognition people get when they see a face out of context, maybe from a magazine profile or a tech conference keynote. But the connection never quite landed. He was just another face in the crowd. When the gate agent announced boarding for first class, Julian was one of the first to rise from his seat. He approached the gate with that same unhurried pace, scanned his boarding pass, and made his way down the jet bridge. He was heading for seat 1A. To Julian, 1A wasn't just a seat. It was a ritual. It was the best seat on the plane, offering a sliver more legroom and a semi-private view out the window. But more than that, it was his spot. It was the throne he had earned after countless red-eyes, delayed flights, and lonely nights in hotel rooms. It was the one constant in a life of perpetual motion. It was a silent acknowledgement to himself of how far he had come from the days of flying coach, crammed in a middle seat with his knees pressed against his chest. As he settled in, the familiar sensations of the cabin washed over him. The faint, sterile scent of cleaning solution. The cool touch of the worn leather headrest. He slid his briefcase smoothly under the seat in front of him and placed his phone in the side pocket. He was a creature of habit, and this routine was as ingrained as breathing. He anticipated nothing more than the gentle hum of the engines and the welcome oblivion of cruising altitude. He was wrong. Comfort, he was about to be brutally reminded, is a fragile and deceptive thing. 2 rows behind him, a different kind of energy entered the cabin. It was a loud, obnoxious swagger encapsulated in a man in his late 20s. Tall, with sandy blonde hair perfectly coiffed to look effortlessly messy, he was a walking stereotype of generational wealth. He wore a pastel pink button-down with the sleeves rolled up just so, showcasing a ridiculously expensive-looking watch. Designer sunglasses were perched on his head like a crown. His name, Julian would later learn, was Carter Sloane. Julian paid him no mind at first, but in a matter of moments, this walking embodiment of privilege would become the catalyst for a chain reaction that would be felt from the cockpit to the boardroom. The flight attendants were moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency, their smiles a little too bright under the fluorescent lights. The pre-boarding dance was almost complete. It was then that Julian heard the soft, hesitant footsteps stop beside his row. He looked up into the face of a young flight attendant. She was petite, with sharp, nervous eyes that darted around as if looking for an escape route. Her smile was a tight, painful-looking thing. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice a strained whisper. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, a flicker of movement that Julian registered as odd. "I'm so sorry, but we're going to need you to switch seats. There seems to have been a mix-up with the seating assignments." Julian blinked, the words taking a moment to register through the fog of exhaustion from his trip. A mix-up? He pulled out his boarding pass, a reflex more than anything. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat. 1A, it's right here." She nodded frantically, her head bobbing like a buoy in a storm. "Yes, I understand that, sir. I see that, but this gentleman..." She gestured vaguely toward the galley area, where Carter Sloane was now leaning against a bulkhead, scrolling through his phone with an air of profound boredom. "This gentleman was supposed to have this seat reserved for him." Julian's brow furrowed. Reserved. The word hung in the air, smelling of bullshit. He had flown millions of miles. He knew the intricate systems that governed airline seating. There was no such thing as a last-minute VIP reservation that could magically overwrite a ticketed, confirmed, and already occupied first-class seat. Not unless there was an air marshal involved or the plane was on fire. The flight attendant's nervous energy, the way she refused to make direct eye contact, told him this wasn't a computer glitch. This was a command from on high. Whatever this was, it was about to shatter the quiet peace of his journey home. Julian kept his body language neutral, his back straight against the seat, but his voice was laced with a calm, steely curiosity. "I booked this flight 6 weeks ago. First class, seat 1A. I'm failing to understand why I would need to move now, just moments before takeoff." The flight attendant shifted her weight, the polished floor of the jet seeming to get slicker beneath her feet. Her eyes darted again to Carter, who was now watching the exchange with a detached smirk, as if observing a mildly amusing play he had seen many times before. "It's just, he's an Ascend Air Onyx Elite member," she said, her voice dropping even lower, as if sharing a state secret. "He's one of our most frequent and valued flyers. It would make things much easier for the crew if you could be flexible and take another seat for this one trip." The atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. The low hum of conversation faltered. A few other passengers in the forward cabin were now pretending to be engrossed in their magazines or phones, but their ears were tuned in, their bodies angled slightly toward the unfolding drama. It wasn't a scene yet, but the electrical current of a potential conflict was crackling in the recycled air. Julian slowly turned his head and, for the first time, truly looked at the man he was being asked to displace himself for. Carter Sloane met his gaze, the smirk widening into a look of entitled expectation. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a polite, "Sorry for the mix-up." He didn't even acknowledge Julian as a fellow human being. He just stared, a silent challenge in his eyes, waiting for Julian to fold, as he so clearly expected everyone to do. A wave of cold fury, sharp and sudden, washed over Julian. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about the casual, arrogant assumption that he, Julian Vance, was the more movable object, that his plans, his comfort, his very presence were secondary. Julian's voice remained dangerously calm. "And where, exactly, would you like to put me?" The flight attendant hesitated, her relief at his question palpable. She thought he was negotiating. "Seat 4B, sir. It's still in first class, of course. A middle seat, just a few rows back." A middle seat. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He'd be giving up the best seat on the plane for the worst, all to appease the ego of a smirking child. It wasn't about the legroom or the view, it was about the principle. Carter Sloane didn't want seat 1A because it was objectively better. He wanted it because it was a symbol. It was the seat of power, of priority. And the airline, the very same airline to whom Julian's company paid millions of dollars and whose critical infrastructure his company protected, was willing to discard him like trash to placate this Onyx elite member. He opened his mouth to deliver a calm but firm no, but a voice from across the aisle beat him to it. Why on earth should he have to move? The voice belonged to an older woman, probably in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a ramrod-straight posture. Her tone was like a headmistress addressing a naughty schoolchild. Calm, but radiating an authority that made people snap to attention. "He was here first. He's settled. His ticket says 1A. Leave the man alone." The flight attendant's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. She completely ignored the woman, turning her pleading eyes back to Julian, her unspoken message clear. "Please don't make this difficult." In that split second, Julian wasn't in a plane over Queens. He was in a stuffy boardroom 20 years ago, being told his presentation could wait because the real executives needed to talk. He was in a venture capitalist's office, being patronizingly told that his revolutionary idea was a cute little project, but not scalable. He was at a dozen different networking events where he was ignored and dismissed until someone whispered his name and title, at which point the very people who had looked through him suddenly became his best friends. He had spent a lifetime learning to pick his battles, to absorb the small slights in service of the larger goal. But he had also learned that some moments aren't small. Some moments are foundational. They define not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. "I'm not moving," he said finally. The words were quiet, but they landed in the silent cabin with the force of a gavel. The flight attendant gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, her face a mask of professional frustration. She turned on her heel and marched back toward the galley. Julian could hear the sibilant whisper of her voice mingling with a deeper male tone. The smirk had vanished from Carter Sloane's face, replaced by a flicker of disbelief and irritation. The other passengers quickly resumed their pre-flight rituals, but the tension remained, a low-grade hum beneath the surface. Julian knew this was far from over. An organization that would bend its own rules this far for one person wouldn't simply give up. They weren't done trying to get him out of that seat. What he couldn't have possibly known was just how public, how humiliating, and how catastrophically stupid their next attempt would be. What do you think you would have done in his shoes? Would you have moved to keep the peace, or would you have held your ground? Let me know your honest answer in the comments below. And while you're down there, if you're enjoying this story, give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel, and it lets me know you want more content like this. The boarding process continued its slow, methodical crawl. The last of the economy passengers shuffled past, casting curious glances into the first-class cabin, unaware of the silent war being waged. Julian could feel the weight of those glances. He could feel the smug, irritated stare of Carter Sloane, who had now taken a seat in the row behind him, clearly stewing. The kid was like a chessboard player, impatiently waiting for his opponent's next move, already certain of his own victory. The move came sooner than Julian had anticipated. The same nervous flight attendant reappeared, but this time she was not alone. She was flanked by a man who was clearly her superior, the purser. He was tall, with a severe haircut, and a brisk, no-nonsense demeanor that radiated impatience. He leaned into Julian's space, a clear physical intimidation tactic. "Mr. Vance," the purser began, his voice low but sharp, a tool designed to cut through any argument. "I'm the head purser on this flight. I'm afraid there's been a significant seating miscommunication. We really need you to relocate so that Mr. Sloane can take his assigned spot. It's becoming important to our operational timeline." Julian slowly raised an eyebrow, his own calmness a stark contrast to the man's coiled tension. "Important to your operations," he repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Or important to him?" His voice wasn't raised, but it was clear and carried easily to the nearby rows. Heads popped up over the tops of seats again. This time, Carter Sloane himself decided to enter the fray. He stood up, leaning over the back of the seat in front of him, and offered Julian a smile that was all teeth. "Listen, man," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's not a big deal. I fly this route every week, every single week. Seat 1A is my spot. The crew knows it, the system knows it. It's nothing personal, just business." Julian turned his head slowly to face him, his eyes like chips of ice. "It becomes personal," he said, his words precise and measured. "The moment you expect another human being to give up a seat they paid for, simply because you want it, that's the definition of personal." The air between them grew thick and heavy. The purser quickly tried to intercede. "Gentlemen, please, let's not escalate this. We can resolve this without a what?" The older woman across the aisle cut in again, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Without making a scene?" "Sir," she said, addressing the purser directly, "this is a scene, and it is not this gentleman who is making it. It is you, your crew, and that entitled young man." A man in the second row, dressed in a sharp business suit, nodded in firm agreement. "She's right. The boarding pass determines the seat. It's the fundamental rule of air travel. End of story." Julian saw the purser and the flight attendant exchange a quick, panicked glance. This was not going according to their script. They had expected a quiet, compliant passenger, not a man of immovable principle backed by a jury of his peers. But instead of de-escalating, the purser doubled down, his tone hardening from firm to overtly threatening. "If you refuse to cooperate with the instructions of the flight crew, sir, we will be forced to delay the departure of this aircraft, and if it comes to that, we will have to involve our ground security to have you removed." The threat was out in the open now, ugly and stark. A few passengers gasped. Others muttered angrily. The annoyance that had been directed at the situation was now focusing squarely on the crew. Julian leaned back in his seat, his gaze locked with the purser's. He didn't flinch. "If delaying this flight is what it takes for your crew to understand the simple concept of a confirmed ticket," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "then I guess we're going to be delayed, because I am not moving." The purser's jaw tightened. He had played his trump card, and it had been met with a royal flush. He gave a curt nod, turned, and marched back to the galley, the flight attendant scurrying behind him. Carter Sloane slumped back into his seat, his face a thunderous mask of fury, furiously typing on his phone. Julian exhaled slowly, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. He had stood his ground, but the victory felt hollow. He knew this kind of corporate arrogance didn't just fizzle out. Minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and practiced. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen from the flight deck. We're just finalizing our seating arrangements and closing up the aircraft now. We should be pushing back from the gate here in just a few moments. We appreciate your patience." Julian heard those two words, seating arrangements, and they sounded like a warning bell. They were still maneuvering, still trying to find a way to win. He had no idea their final move would be a full-scale public assault, designed to break him through sheer humiliation. The jet bridge had been pulled away, and the cabin was sealed. They were officially a self-contained world hurtling toward a confrontation. Julian had just opened a folder from his briefcase, trying to force his mind back to the details of the Phoenix deal, when he saw them returning. It was the tall, severe purser, but this time he was accompanied by a man in a crisp Ascend Air-Ground uniform. The man's polished silver badge glinted under the overhead lights, identifying him as a ground operations supervisor. His smile was wide, plastic, and utterly devoid of warmth. The kind of smile people wear when they are about to deliver terrible news with feigned pleasantness. "Mr. Vance," the supervisor said, his voice booming through the now silent forward cabin. He wasn't speaking to Julian. He was performing for the entire audience. "I'm Mike, the ground supervisor. We're going to have to ask you one last time to please move to your reassigned seat so that we can accommodate our Onyx Elite member and get this flight underway." Every head in first class snapped toward him. This was no longer a quiet dispute. This was a public shaming. They were deliberately broadcasting the confrontation, painting him as the unreasonable problem passenger holding up the entire plane. Julian carefully placed his folder on the empty seat beside him. He met the supervisor's gaze. "And I'm going to have to tell you, Mike, one last time, I am not moving. I have a confirmed ticket for this seat. I boarded with that ticket, and I am sitting in it. The issue is not with me." The supervisor's plastic smile never wavered. He glanced theatrically toward Carter Sloane, who was now standing again, watching the scene with renewed confidence. Then back to Julian. "Sir, I need to remind you that refusing to comply with crew instructions is a serious matter. It can result in your removal from this aircraft and potential fines." A hot flush of pure rage rose in Julian's chest. It wasn't fear. It was fury at the blatant, manipulative tactic. They were trying to force him to back down by making him the public enemy. The older woman across the aisle had heard enough. "This is absolutely absurd," she declared, her voice ringing with indignation. "You can't just kick a paying passenger out of his assigned seat because someone else whined that they wanted it. Who do you people think you are?" A wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. The man in the business suit spoke up again, his voice loud and clear. "Yeah, that's not how the contract of carriage works. This is wrong, and I suspect everyone with a phone here is recording it." Julian noticed Carter Sloane shift uncomfortably, his smirk finally faltering as he realized the tide of public opinion was turning against him. But the supervisor was a dog with a bone. He would not let it go. "We are simply asking for your cooperation so that we can depart on time," he insisted, his voice still painfully loud. "If you'd like to discuss this further, I would be happy to have you deplane with me, and we can talk about it at the gate desk." The trap was set. Julian looked the supervisor dead in the eye. "Let me see if I understand you correctly," he said, his own voice now carrying a sharp edge of command that made the supervisor's smile flicker. "You're offering to remove me from the seat I paid for, take me off the plane I am ticketed to be on. Also, we can have a conversation about why I should voluntarily give up my seat to someone else. Is that the offer?" The supervisor was momentarily speechless. Julian had stripped the euphemism away and laid the ugly truth bare for everyone to see. "Sir, it would be best for everyone if we could handle this without any further disruption." Julian leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough that it felt more intimate, more intense. "The only disruption here, Mike, is you and your crew standing in the aisle of a plane that should be moving, trying to bully a customer out of something he rightfully purchased. If this were a genuine clerical error, your first action would have been to reseat Mr. Sloan, not me. But this isn't about an error, is it? It's about status, and you made a choice." The silence that followed was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and damning. The passengers stared, no longer trying to hide their attention, waiting to see who would break first. Finally, the supervisor's smile dissolved completely, replaced by a thin, hard line. "Very well," he clipped out. "Stay in your seat." Without another word, he turned and stalked away, the purser and flight attendant trailing in his wake like defeated soldiers. Julian leaned back against the headrest, but his muscles remained coiled and tight. He could feel the eyes of every passenger on him, some supportive, some curious, some just irritated that the soap opera was delaying their journey. The plane finally pushed back from the gate. For the rest of the taxi and takeoff, Julian stared out the window at the glittering lights of New York City, not wanting to look at the man sitting a few rows behind him, who, for the first time in what was likely a very long time, didn't get what he wanted. But the incident had left a bitter taste in his mouth. Julian didn't realize it yet, but the sting of that public humiliation, the sheer disrespect of it all, was already hardening into something far colder, far more powerful, and infinitely more expensive than an airline ticket. The Airbus A321 touched down at LAX just after the last vestiges of sunset had bled from the California sky. A profound sense of relief washed over the cabin as the seatbelt sign pinged off. Julian remained in his seat, patiently waiting for the initial rush of deplaning passengers to thin out. As he finally stood and pulled his rollerboard from the overhead bin, he noticed Carter Sloan hurry past him down the aisle, pointedly avoiding eye contact. The older woman from across the aisle caught Julian's eye as he stepped out. She gave him a small conspiratorial nod, a silent acknowledgement that said, "You did the right thing." But it didn't feel good. The right thing rarely does in the moment. The encounter had left an invisible bruise on his psyche. It wasn't just what had happened. It was how it had happened. Publicly. Deliberately. With the full institutional weight of the airline leveraged against him, all based on the arrogant assumption that he would bend, that he would break. Walking through the sprawling, chaotic terminal at LAX, his mind was a relentless replay machine. The nervous flight attendant's downcast eyes, the purser's thinly veiled threat, the supervisor's booming, accusatory voice, the entitled smirk on Carter Sloan's face. Each memory was a piece of evidence, stacking up in a case he never asked to be a part of. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was a symptom of a deep cultural rot. A company that empowered its employees to treat a paying customer like an obstacle was a company that had fundamentally lost its way. By the time he slid into the cool leather seat of the black sedan he had waiting for him, the city lights of Los Angeles were a blur of neon and possibility. His driver, A kind, middle-aged man named Carlos asked him if the flight had been smooth. "We made it, Carlos," Julian replied, his voice flat. That's all that matters. At home, in the sterile quiet of his minimalist Pacific Palisades house overlooking the ocean, the silence did little to soothe him. He dropped his briefcase on the massive marble island in his kitchen and poured himself a glass of cold water, the events of the flight still churning in his gut. His phone buzzed insistently on the countertop, a string of emails from his executive team celebrating the final details of the New York deal. Normally, that news would have been a jolt of exhilaration. Tonight, it felt distant, muted. He sat there in the dark, staring at the condensation on his glass. He thought about the countless times in his career he had let small slights go, prioritizing the long game over momentary satisfaction. He'd always told his mentees to never let emotion cloud their business judgment. But this felt different. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an insult, not just to him, but to the very principles of fairness and respect he had built his life and his company upon. The airline, in its infinite arrogance, had no idea who Julian Vance was. They didn't know that Axiom Digital wasn't just another corporate account. They were the architects and guardians of Ascend Air's most critical internal software systems. The complex digital ballet of flight scheduling, maintenance logging, crew management, and baggage tracking. It all ran on platforms designed, built, and maintained by Axiom. With the New York deal now signed and sealed, his schedule for the next week was, for the first time in months, surprisingly open. An idea, cold and sharp, began to form in his mind. He picked up his phone and dialed his COO, Trevor, a man who had been with him since the garage days. Trevor answered on the second ring, his voice sharp with caffeine. "You're still at the office?" Julian asked. "Just buttoning up the reports from the New York deal," Trevor replied. "Figured you'd want them first thing. What's up? You sound tight." Julian's tone was calm, almost dangerously casual. "Trevor, I need you to do something for me. First thing in the morning, pull up every contract, every service-level agreement, every addendum we have with Ascend Air. I want the full scope. Terms, renewal dates, support clauses, everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Trevor was smart. He knew Julian didn't make idle requests. "Sure, Julian, no problem, but may I ask why?" "I'll explain tomorrow," Julian said, his voice low and steady. "Let's meet at 7 a.m. in my office." After hanging up, Julian leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to unclench. For the first time all evening, his thoughts weren't circling the past. They were rocketing toward the future. The plan forming in his mind wasn't about petty revenge for one miserable flight. It was about education. It was about making damn sure that the executives at Ascend Air, the people who fostered a culture where such disrespect was possible, would learn exactly who they were dealing with. They were about to get a multi-billion-dollar lesson in a very simple concept: cause and effect. The Marine layer was still clinging to the Santa Monica Mountains when Julian pulled into his reserved spot at the gleaming glass tower that housed the Axiom Digital headquarters. The sun was a pale, golden smear on the horizon. The security guard at the front desk, a friendly former Marine named Dave, greeted him with a warm, "Morning, Mr. Vance?" Julian returned the greeting, his mind already 3 floors up, locked and loaded for the conversation to come. Trevor was waiting in Julian's sprawling corner office, a stack of documents neatly piled on the massive oak desk, and his laptop open. The man was the epitome of efficiency. "I pulled everything," Trevor said, skipping the pleasantries. "Our main enterprise contract with Ascend runs for another 7 months. Renewal discussions are scheduled to begin in August. As you know, we provide their core operational software, flight scheduling, maintenance tracking, crew management, and the baggage logistics suite. To put it mildly, if our systems went down, their entire national operation would be grounded in under an hour. They'd be in absolute chaos. Julian sat down in his leather chair, picking up the top document and flipping through the pages, though he already knew them by heart. "And the competition?" he asked, his eyes scanning the fine print. "How many other carriers have we had preliminary talks with? Carriers who would kill for this exact software package if it suddenly became available?" A slow, knowing smirk spread across Trevor's face. He knew where this was going. At least 3 major players. 2 of them are Ascend's direct blood-in-the-water competitors. They've been trying to get a meeting with our top development team for years. Julian closed the folder with a soft, definitive thud. "Good. Then we're going to start those conversations today. Quietly, of course, effective immediately. I want Ascend Air moved to the absolute bottom of our client priority list. No more extras, no more going above and beyond, no more fast-tracked support tickets. They will receive the bare minimum service that is legally required by the letter of our contract. Nothing more. They treated me like a low-priority nuisance on my own flight. Let's see how they enjoy being treated as a low-priority nuisance in their own operations." Trevor's eyebrows shot up. "Jesus, Julian, what the hell happened on that flight?" Julian leaned back in his chair, looking out at the waking city below. "It's about a culture of respect, Trevor. They made a calculated decision to publicly humiliate me for the convenience of someone they deemed more valuable. Not because of a mistake, not because of a safety issue, but because they thought they could get away with it. They thought I was a nobody. I want them to understand that the seat they tried to take from me yesterday is about to become the most expensive seat in the history of their airline." Trevor nodded slowly, the smirk gone, replaced by a look of grim understanding. "Do you want me to give them a heads up? A warning shot across the bow?" "No," Julian said firmly, his eyes cold as steel. "No warnings. Let them feel it. Let the pressure build. Let them scramble and panic and wonder what the hell is going on. I don't want them to connect the dots. I want the dots to connect them." For the rest of the morning, Julian and his senior executive team huddled in the main conference room, mapping out their strategy. It was a masterclass in corporate warfare, executed with the precision of a surgical strike. They meticulously reviewed every single touchpoint Ascend Air had with Axiom Digital. They devised a plan to subtly and systematically reallocate their top support engineers and developers to other, more deserving client accounts, all without technically violating the terms of their current contract. It wasn't about being vindictive, it was about being strategic. They were simply choosing to reward their partners, and Ascend Air was no longer a partner. They were a liability. By noon, the first discreet calls were being made to Ascend's top 2 competitors. The reception was, as Trevor had predicted, overwhelmingly enthusiastic. The rival airlines were practically drooling at the prospect of getting their hands on Axiom's legendary software suite. Julian didn't rush the pitch. He let them lead the conversation. He wanted this move to feel organic, inevitable, not like a knee-jerk reaction to a personal slight. As the team filed out of the conference room, energized and focused, Trevor lingered behind. "Are you sure you don't want to just call their CEO and tell him exactly why you're burning his company to the ground?" Julian paused at the door, a faint, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. "They'll figure it out, Trevor, and when they do, I want them to remember that this entire multi-million-dollar catastrophe could have been avoided. All it would have taken was 2 simple words from a single flight attendant. Enjoy your flight, Mr. Vance." What Julian didn't expect, however, was how quickly the first tremors of their earthquake would be felt, and just how much sheer, unadulterated panic it would unleash within the hallowed halls of Ascend Air's corporate headquarters. The first sign of trouble appeared exactly 3 days later. It started small. Julian was in his office, reviewing the final implementation plan for the New York contract, when Trevor walked in without knocking, holding his phone out with the speakerphone already activated. "You're going to want to hear this," he said, a glint of triumph in his eye. On the line was a frantic, high-pitched voice belonging to a regional operations manager at Ascend Air's Chicago O'Hare hub. "And the baggage routing system is lagging again," the man was saying, his voice tight with stress. "We've got a backlog of 3 flights worth of luggage on the tarmac. The system is just running slower than molasses, and our support tickets are sitting in your queue with no response. We used to get a call back in minutes. It's been hours. We're at risk of a major delay cascade that could ripple across the whole country." Trevor gave Julian a pointed look. Julian simply leaned back in his chair, a silent observer, and let the man on the phone continue his panicked tirade. By the end of the week, the problem was no longer small. The calls were no longer coming from regional managers. They were coming directly from Ascend Air's corporate headquarters in Dallas. Their senior vice president of operations, a woman with a reputation for being unflappable, was trying her best to sound composed, but the strain in her voice was unmistakable. "Mr. Vance," she said, after Julian finally agreed to take her call. "We've noticed a significant shift in the service level we've been receiving from your team over the past week. Our systems are experiencing unprecedented latency issues, and support response times have fallen off a cliff. Is there some internal issue at Axiom that we should be aware of?" Julian's reply was a masterpiece of corporate politeness, each word carefully chosen and delivered with ice-cold precision. "Ma'am, I can assure you there are no internal issues. Your service level is exactly what is specified in Section 4, Paragraph B of our contractual agreement. Nothing more, nothing less." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Julian could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she processed the implicit message. The good old days are over. "I see," she finally said, her voice strained. "Well, in that case, we would like to arrange an emergency meeting to discuss an extension and a significant upgrade to our current terms. We are prepared to be very flexible." Julian cut her off before she could finish, his voice steady and final. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. My team and I are already in deep-level talks with other carriers about our next-generation logistics suite. We will, of course, continue to fulfill our current agreement with you to the letter, right up until the last day. But beyond that, I believe our corporate priorities are better aligned elsewhere. It was polite, it was professional, and it was a death sentence." 2 weeks later, the whispers had turned into roars within the aviation industry. The news was out. Axiom Digital, the gold standard in airline software, was parting ways with Ascend Air and actively courting its competitors. Ascend Air wasn't collapsing. Not yet. But their operations were being crippled by 1,000 small cuts. Flight delays were up 15%. Mishandled baggage reports had doubled. Crew scheduling errors were causing last-minute cancellations. Their rock-solid reputation for reliability was taking subtle but noticeable hits, the kind of reputational damage that festers and spreads like a cancer. One afternoon, a hand-delivered letter arrived at Julian's office. It wasn't on standard corporate letterhead. It was on the personal, embossed stationery of the CEO of Ascend Air himself. The letter was short and to the point. It vaguely acknowledged a regrettable customer service incident on one of their flights, offered a stilted apology for any misunderstanding, and expressed a fervent hope that they could find a way to rebuild their crucial business relationship. Julian read it once, folded it neatly, and slid it into his desk drawer. An apology delivered weeks later, only after the stock price had started to dip and the operational reports were bleeding red ink, wasn't an apology. It was a damage control tactic. It was a business decision, not an act of contrition. That night, Julian was having dinner with his oldest friend, a retired judge. He recounted the whole story, from the flight to the letter. "So," the judge asked, swirling the wine in his glass. "What's your next move? You're not actually going to let them go under, are you?" Julian looked out at the ocean, a faint smile playing on his lips. "People think disrespect is a fleeting moment," he said, more to himself than to his friend. "They think it's a small thing you can just brush past and forget. But they're wrong. Sometimes, a single moment of disrespect is the catalyst that decides how the entire next chapter of a story is written, for them and for you." "So, you're not going back to them?" his friend pressed. Julian took a sip of his bourbon. "Not unless they want to buy a ticket on my flight," he said, "and I'll be sitting in seat 1A. The real moral of this story isn't about revenge. It's that respect isn't about a person's title or their perceived status or the brand of their watch. It's about how you treat another human being when you think you have all the power, when you think no one is watching. The smallest choices, the most casual dismissals, can end up costing you the most. And sometimes, the bill for that disrespect doesn't show up until it's far, far too late to pay. If you have ever been in Julian's shoes, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside, remember this story. Remember that you have more power and more value than the people who dismiss you can possibly comprehend. Use that power wisely. Stand your ground when it truly matters, and never, ever let someone else decide your worth for you. Because sometimes the person sitting in the quietest seat on the plane can end up making the loudest statement you've ever heard. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And I mean it when I say, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you stood your ground. Let's continue the conversation.